Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We've got a few people coming through the door still. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. If you're not familiar with Computer Measurement Group, we are a not-for-profit worldwide organization for IT professionals that's committed to information sharing and best practices that is focused on ensuring the efficiency and scalability of IT service delivery. We offer in-person and online events just like this one. And I want to thank you for joining us today for Control Your COBOL Future in 2018, which is sponsored by GT Software. Before we get started, I do want to make sure that you know that you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar panel, and we will be doing Q&A at the end of today's session. If you have a question throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and submit it, and then we will pull all of those at the end. Any questions we don't get to, we'll post on our blog at cmg.org. And now I'm really pleased to introduce you to Walter Sweat. Walter is the principal technical architect at GT Software. He has over 40 years experience working on mainframe applications, as well as mainframe migration and modernization projects. Prior to working at GT Software, Walter worked for numerous Fortune 500 companies such as Home Depot and Dell. And lastly, Walter has a degree from my alma mater, Georgia Tech. So Walter, welcome.
Amanda, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. And thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today as we talk about one of my favorite subjects, and that's COBOL. We kind of feel that probably most of you are existing companies and organizations who use COBOL, who for whatever reason are perhaps looking for alternatives for your existing and new applications. So what we'd like to cover in the next 30 minutes or so is how you might want to consider GT Software and our role as the exclusive worldwide distributor for Fujitsu's NetCOBOL as you look at alternatives or just look to see what's going on in the COBOL world today. I want to spend some time talking about the mechanics of how you might go about such a move from one COBOL to another, and also the benefits that go along with them. And to me, this is really important. We want to talk about how you can keep your risk to a minimum as you look at different COBOL alternatives. Now, I'm just going to bet that the majority of you have long-standing applications that are probably one of the cornerstones of your business. Well, keeping those applications working as they always have and keeping risk to a minimum to make that happen is obviously critical. To me, risk is one of the most important components of any migration or transformation, and keeping costs to a minimum is also very important. And so today I want to share with you some of the ways that Fujitsu's NetCOBOL lets you really control your costs as your business hopefully continues to grow. So for those of you who don't actually know who GT Software is, we're an Atlanta-based company with over 35 years of experience and hopefully expertise in providing real-time mainframe integration and migration solutions. We have a broad base of customers worldwide that use our technologies in mission-critical business applications, and we continue to focus on how to help organizations take advantage of combining their legacy environments with the technologies of today and also tomorrow. And one of the ways we do that is we are also the provider of one of the leading COBOL development and deployment platforms in the world. So when we talk about some of the perspectives of why you look at different COBOL alternatives, one of the critical ones obviously is to save money. And so we might ask, what are some of the ways you can save money? Well, to me, a question I would want to ask is, if you do development in languages other than COBOL also, do you have to pay for the right for your users or customers to run those applications? As an example, if you do development in C# or VB.NET or C++ or Java, are there fees for those runtimes? Well, no, of course there aren't. So even though you've already deployed your applications to an existing customer or user base, being able to know going forward that there are no more runtime fees is huge. And as I mentioned before, hopefully your business is growing. And if you want to spin up a new server environment or a new cloud deployment environment so that you can make your applications more accessible, another question to me is, why would you ever want to pay again for the rights to run that same application? Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to say that no matter how many server instances you deploy to or how many instances in the cloud, you know what the runtime cost will be? And to me, that should be zero. We've talked to so many customers who come to us because they were shocked and really dismayed to see what new runtime deployment licenses were going to cost them, almost to the point that they couldn't deploy their applications where they needed to. They just felt totally out of control. And being in control of your costs is, to all of us, very critical always. So in terms of that deployment flexibility that we talked about, I always find an interesting topic to be virtualization. I'm curious to hear, hopefully we'll hear some of the questions mention this, is virtualization important to you? Quick story. So the first mainframe computer on which I worked was, I hate to admit this, an old IBM 360 Model 20 card-based computer, and it had an astounding 64K of memory. You know, moving forward from that in way less than 10 years, I was working on a virtualized mainframe with what we thought was an astounding amount of memory. We had so much that this foreign concept called virtualization was put in place so that each developer had his or her own safe and guaranteed workspace. Now, back in those dark age days, we didn't have to worry about the cost of COBOL if we added new virtualized environments. It just went hand in hand that COBOL would be readily and freely available if we needed more computing virtualized power. So when we talk about virtualization, I'd like to just make sure that we all kind of agree on what virtualization really is. To me, virtualization offers the ability to maximize usage of computer resources. It provides a method to handle expanding and contracting growth, which is really important. It gives you the flexibility in determining where your applications run. It also offers you the ability to secure your applications. And it gives you the ability, like in the cloud, to grow in the easiest way possible. So if we kind of can agree on, those being the basic concepts of virtualization, I hope we could also agree that being able to distribute your applications without restrictions in that kind of environment is important. So we here at GT Software obviously have an affinity for the mainframe since we've been, as I said, working in that space for 35 plus years now. But we also have an affinity for other spaces like .NET and Linux. And what we see with those environments is that if you write a program in a language native to each of those, for instance, C# and .NET, you never have to worry at all about any extra costs when you look to deploy your applications in any of those environments. You really don't have to worry about being restricted when you need to alter your distribution landscape. And that's because the cost of deploying your already written COBOL applications makes it cost prohibitive to meet your changing business requirements if you don't worry about that, if you do have to worry about run times. So in terms of that flexibility and controllable costs, well, to me, when I mention costs like the virtualization deployment costs that we just talked about, I always wonder, what are the costs that you actually can control? Well, most software tool providers charge per developer. I think that's just a given. It's a given that you can expect to have to pay in one way or the other for the tools that your developers use to develop your applications. Certainly, it's true that you can choose to use shareware or freeware or open source languages, but to me, there's a cost associated with those as well. That cost might come in the form of reduced functionality that the freeware product entails, or it might be in the support costs that are associated with open source. And I'm not saying that either of those is a bad thing. I'm just saying that, at least in my opinion, there is nothing that is totally free. You have to make choices that are applicable to your own environment. However, to me, the difference comes in when you go to deploy those applications. Like, what if you want to change the hardware on which your systems run? Should you be charged more just because you need to run on a bigger machine? No. What if your business triples and you need to run your applications on more servers? Should you be charged more for that? To me, again, the answer is no. And those are just a couple of examples of what many customers that we've talked to face when they choose their COBOL compiler and the runtime from a company that charges for each distribution environment. And let me tell you, we've talked to countless customers who have said that this has had a detrimental effect on them when they need to provide their application to those new customer environments that we mentioned earlier. Here at GT, when we choose to write an application utility, as an example, in something like VB.net to provide to one of our migration customers, we don't want or expect that customer to have to be concerned about paying for the right to run that program in multiple places. And we certainly don't want them to have to worry about keeping up with how many servers that utility will run on. So why in the world should those customers be any more inclined to have to worry about those concerns with software that they've written for themselves? Well, it's our thought that they shouldn't have to be. Auditing, in terms of deployment flexibility, is a really intriguing topic. So there are a couple of more, I think, important questions I'd like for you to consider as we talk about the concepts of auditing. Today, do you know who every user is who's gaining benefit from your applications? Where are they? Who are they? What if they change hardware? What if their hardware gets upgraded or broken? Who are the web users of your applications? What's the cost of keeping up with where those applications run? And then what's the cost if you were audited about your runtime fees? Well, the reason that that's important to us is that there are COBOL providers who do charge runtime fees and who do aggressively audit their existing customer bases. So it concerns us when we talk to those customers who discuss having been audited by their software vendor, almost to the point where they have to dedicate staff to keep up with where their software is distributed, and even when there's a change to the hardware. It concerns us similarly that when we hear customers saying that if they want to change the configuration of their server deployment, that they have to contact their COBOL vendor to notify them of that change. It concerns us that customers are not able to grow their business in a controlled environment where they don't have to make COBOL distribution costs a primary consideration in their plans. So to me, and hopefully this is one of the reasons you're here, the question I would like to ask you is, do you have any of those same concerns? We hear them often, and that's one of the reasons that we are associated with and think so highly of Fujitsu NetCOBOL. So in terms of that deployment flexibility, if any of those questions that we've talked about apply to you, we think that NetCOBOL is an interesting alternative to consider. And as the worldwide distributor of NetCOBOL outside of Japan, we have seen it to be a rock-solid, well-performing COBOL environment with a long and rich heritage. It started out as part of the old Amdahl mainframe environment. It's been around that long. It is solid. it performs well, it's something you can always depend on. And we also feel that NetCOBOL can afford a customer more flexibility than perhaps they're seeing with their existing COBOL environments as they look at altering where those applications are deployed. I like to think that NetCOBOL can offer a more cost-friendly model for deployments for customers who need to work in a virtualized or cloud environment. Heck, deployment of your COBOL applications is free, no matter the size of the server on which they'll run or on how many they'll run. How much more cost-friendly can you get than that, I'd like to think. We also feel that NetCOBOL is worth considering for every company that uses COBOL today, and especially for those who are concerned at all about cost and flexibility. So that's what we're going to talk about, the benefits of NetCOBOL and then some of the technical capabilities that go along with it that will hopefully make it interesting for you to look at a little more. But first, why would you even want to consider converting one application away from your existing COBOL provider to look at NetCOBOL? Well, as I've said before, most people, it has to do with cost and savings. But you have to look at why that matters, I think. Every dollar that you have to spend or your customers have to spend makes obtaining a solid ROI on your development efforts that much more challenging, I feel. And if you're competing against other companies in providing software to your customers, if your customers have to pay runtime fees for the right to run your software, and they don't have to pay runtime fees for the right to run your competitor's software, well, you're just at a competitive disadvantage. And if you're developing software for use in your own company, obviously every dollar you spend on runtime fees is a dollar you don't have available for other tools and expenses. For many companies, the cost of running your software is a significant expense, and it is ongoing. You may have developed a program 20 years ago and not have changed it one time since then. Does it make sense to have to pay runtime fees every time a new user of that program comes along, whether in-house or a customer of yours? That can obviously make it much harder to sell your software. And if you do sell your software, you have to either eat the cost of the runtime fees or you have to pass it along to your customers, again, raising the fees that you charge. And importantly, I think, this may not have happened to you, but it is time-consuming and challenging to keep up with where every runtime deployment has occurred and still have to worry about being audited. Many companies have been audited based on those deployed runtimes. We've seen examples of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in fines and negotiations because of these audits. And that's something that just is so easily avoided. So to me, there's a cost to manage your runtime licenses just in people time. And understanding what that is important. So we've talked a lot about costs and why some of you might be looking at seeing what the landscape looks like in the COBOL world today. I also want to talk about the technical ends of what COBOL can do. I want to talk about, developing in perhaps a more modern environment, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the new enhancements that are coming out of the COBOL world. So to me, in today's computing environment especially, that ability to have effective and agile tools is paramount. We all have to be concerned about things that we never would have dreamed of when we first started programming with COBOL. The ability to access web data, to provide capabilities for mobile devices to access and use your applications, the need to access web services, the need to obviously develop programs quicker and more securely. All of those things are the challenges that the companies of the world face today when they use any language, and certainly with COBOL. So just as an example, we provide multiple COBOL environments, but I'll talk just today about the Windows and .NET world, because I think Microsoft has done a wonderful job of handling that situation for those companies who lean toward Windows solutions with their Visual Studio environment. No matter the language used, the developers all use the same user interface for development and debugging. And to be able to follow the same debugger, a COBOL program calling a C# program or a VB.NET program calling a COBOL program, is a huge help. And NetCOBOL for .NET is in fact a true .NET language, just like C#, just like VB.NET. It understands things like .NET data types. It generates the same kind and type of executable code as those other languages. And to me, most importantly, it's designed to take advantage of that rich Visual Studio development environment. So just as a couple of examples, as you can see from this screenshot, you have a powerful editor where you can do things like see how data items are defined just by hovering over them. Excuse me. You can add watch values so that you can see data values change as you step through the program's execution. You can click on a copybook and have it open up for you in a completely different window. All of those things just help a COBOL developer make that transition to a newer environment that much easier. Similarly, NetCOBOL working inside of Visual Studio allows developers to work on multi-language solutions all in one environment. In this screenshot, you can see a single solution that has both a NetCOBOL for .NET project here in the lower panel, working alongside a C# project. Where this really comes into play is when you start to debug the entire application and can just seamlessly move from one language type or project to the next, following the data path as you go along. What this allows a developer to do is to use the best language for each situation where it makes sense. I've mentioned this before over the years. If I were going to write an application that needed to process millions of scalar data points in memory, I probably wouldn't do that in COBOL, since that is something that C# would be well designed for. But if I also had to manipulate millions of records and sort them in order to kind of get those data points, I might like to do that in COBOL and then just pass the data along to the C# application. That's why NetCOBOL, being a true .NET language, is, to me, so important. Excuse me. Another thing that's very powerful about NetCOBOL for .NET inside of Visual Studio is you can take advantage of tools like code snippets. So if you have lots of places where you use the same type of code, but there are different variable names that need to be replaced in each section, instead of handwriting that or doing a copy and paste, then having to go back and hopefully remember to change each applicable data name, you can really just use code snippets to create these macros for yourself that give you that very powerful capability to do mass changes. And code snippets are extensible, so you can create as many as you want. The same concept exists for creating new programs from scratch. If you're like me, even though I've been doing COBOL development for 40 plus years, I can never remember what order those darn sections come in. So I probably modified the first COBOL program I ever wrote about 30,000 times just so that I don't have to remember how to write a COBOL program from scratch. Well, with NetCOBOL for .NET with Visual Studio, that extends that capability for me automatically. If I work with a customer who has a lot of standard routines, as an example, that they want all of their developers to use, they can create their own code templates so that all developers start out with a basic core application that is 100% consistent. This is really and especially helpful when you're working with items like standardized I/O routines or error processing routines. And just as with code snippets, you can create as many of those templates as you desire and have them available to all of your developers consistently. And that really provides that agile, effective work environment. So in my opinion, IntelliSense is one of the coolest features ever, and it's one that C# and VB.NET developers have been able to take advantage of for many years. Well, NetCOBOL for .NET is also a true .NET language, and that means that you as a COBOL developer get that same benefit. If you're like me and spell perform as perform every time, the IntelliSense color coding immediately lets me know that I have a typo. And as we see in the example on this screen, IntelliSense lets you type just the first part of a word, and then it'll fill in the rest for you. And if the verb you're typing has a required format, like a perform varying command, It'll remind you to make a valid code construct for the command. In my opinion, once you start to use IntelliSense, you will never want to be without it. It is just a true godsend in terms of being effective and efficient as a developer. So I'm not sure if you've ever had the need to have a different development language read one of your COBOL data files, but it can be really, really difficult, obviously. And that's just if you're looking to have a program written in a different language read a COBOL sequential file. Just imagine how much harder it is if you want that foreign program to read an index file. Well, as another example, Fujitsu provides a set of COBOL file APIs for their file system so that you can have a C# or a VB.NET program directly control your sequential, random, and index files. So rather than having to write intermediary programs to pull data out to a vanilla format where there's no COBOL data types so that they can be read by a program written in a different language, you can now have those programs directly access that data via those APIs. And that can be a huge time saver for you. It really helps lower your risk in that those intermediary programs might not be presenting the data correctly. Here you have both environments reading and working with the same data. So those are just some of the examples of, working in a more hopefully modern environment and some of the flexibilities that it gives you. And what I'd like to talk about next is, let's take a look at some of the new features that are available in COBOL. To me, even though we've all heard for the last 15 years or more that COBOL is dying, well, I contend that is far, far from reality, that COBOL continues to expand its capabilities. And I want to give you just a couple of examples here. First example, being able to select where in your programs you want standard documentation placed without having to go through the effort of actually writing that documentation and ensuring that it is consistently used can be a huge benefit. As we can see from this slide, by just entering in a comment line in strategic places in your program, here on the panel on the left, NetCOBOL can then add in the appropriate system-level documentation for you. What I mean, notice in the panel on the right that the documentation, the comment lines that are generated include things like what the input parameters for the linkage section might be. And this is a place where if we incorporate the code templates that we talked about earlier with XML documentation, you can ensure that you have very consistent documentation generated. COBOL is notorious, in my opinion, as working really well, very consistently, and a lot of times programs will sit around for years without being touched, and the person who originally developed that code may be gone. So having this level of system-type documentation available when someone has to pick that up is a huge plus. Oops. One of my favorite new features for NetCOBOL is the incorporation of the NuGet packages in the Visual Studio and its interface with NetCOBOL. If you haven't heard of it before, NuGet is the package manager for the Microsoft development platform, including .NET. These NuGet client tools provide the ability to produce and consume packages, in essence. So NuGet is a free and open source package manager designed for the Microsoft development platform, and it serves as a larger ecosystem of tools and services. In other words, it pretty much offers free access to solid, proven applications and routines that other people have already written. Here, as an example, in the panel on the left, we see NuGet in operation inside of Visual Studio, where in a NetCOBOL project, I've gone out to look in the NuGet repository for an application that fits my needs. That might be a standard module where I could convert a report to a PDF document, where I could go look for something that automatically converts a report into something in PDF so I don't have to write anything. Another example of one of the thousands of packages that are out there that I think is really cool is the UWP Community Toolkit provided directly by Microsoft. So on the panel on the right, you can see the type of programmability that is just directly available to use, like having your COBOL application, here is an example, directly do queries of the Bing search engine. I mean, to me, that's just seriously cool. Without having to know anything about how to use Bing as a search tool programmatically, I can incorporate those types of searches into my COBOL app. That's really just a prime example of making COBOL the language that still works for us all tomorrow and next year and 20 years from now. Being able to incorporate things like Bing search and Twitter and LinkedIn into a COBOL application really helps us ensure that COBOL continues to grow and can take advantage of all of the techniques and tools that are out there. So we kind of covered, hopefully, the two prime areas that I think might be of interest to many people. That is how to control COBOL costs and ensure that you're getting the best bang for the buck, and also how to ensure that COBOL is providing you the capabilities that you use as you move forward. So at this point, we're about 30 minutes in, and I wanted to see from Amanda if we had any questions come in, and we'll see what y'all had to think and if there's anything extra that we could add. So Amanda, do we have any questions that I might be able to answer at this point?
Hi, yes, Walter. I did have someone that was asking, does it matter how many servers that runtimes are, that we deploy our runtimes to?
Okay, I understand the question. That's perfect. Yeah, no, so that's the beauty of it. You really have the ability to deploy to any number of servers that you want. If you have 10 developers developing an application and they deploy to one server, or they deploy to 10,000 servers with 1 million web users, there is no extra cost for using NetCOBOL. And that is honestly quite unique in the COBOL space. And it's been Fujitsu's approach and GT Software's approach from the beginning, and is not going to change. So that's something very important for all of us, I think. Any other questions, Amanda?
Here's another question. Is it easy to integrate NetCOBOL with other languages?
Interesting question. So yes, I will say that it is, and it depends a little bit on the environment. It's kind of like using a like-for-like basis. As an example, if I'm developing something in .NET with C#, I can use NetCOBOL for .NET because they are both true .NET languages. If I'm developing in Windows with a C++ compiler and I want to have it talk to COBOL, I can use the NetCOBOL for Windows environment. If I'm developing in the Linux world, the NetCOBOL for Linux environment probably operates easier than talking to other applications that are written in languages more consistent with that Linux environment. If you start trying to have Linux talk to C# and COBOL for .NET, that obviously becomes more challenging. But we hope that the fact that there are multiple environments that we provide that are geared for performance gives people the flexibilities that they need.
Great. I have a couple questions related to the cost and the cost model of NetCOBOL. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
Sure, I can. With NetCOBOL, our thought process is kind of like we follow the Microsoft model. You pay per developer. You never pay for runtimes. So it's kind of linear in terms of however many developers you have, no matter whether you're using NetCOBOL in a Linux or Windows or .NET world, the model is the same. You have the ability in the Linux or Windows world to have a single server license available based on the number of developers, or you can deploy to individual workstations, but it is based on that developer model. The runtime component is really quite easy to follow, and that's just you deploy it wherever you want to go, and there are no extra costs for that. Hopefully that made sense, Amanda.
Thank you. And how does that compare to competitors in the market?
For the longest time, we were the only COBOL provider that didn't charge runtimes. and we are still in the vast minority. There are some COBOL providers out there who pay based only on support, and the more support you need or the more capabilities you need, it's kind of a pay as you go. Our model is to say that you're going to get all of the functionality for a set cost. And we are comparable in terms of cost, in my opinion, to the major players out there in terms of what you can expect to pay for the development portion. For the runtime portion, that is where people have seen differences in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars for very large organizations.
Also tied to that, another question just came in about the, are there any caveats to the costs? And perhaps are there charges in relation to audits that you can speak about?
There are none with NetCOBOL. Since we don't charge for runtimes, and that means we don't care where things are deployed. We have a license model that associates a developer to a NetCOBOL license, so that's very straightforward. Once you buy it, you install it on a machine, and it's perpetual and it's there forever. So you don't have to worry about rebuying it every year. It's one and it's done. From the audit perspective, from the runtime perspective, some of our competitors, in all honesty, will send accountants and lawyers out to a site, and they will go query not just where the developers are, but everybody who makes use of a running program, who gets the benefit of it. And that's where we've seen those extremely large fines and fees having to be paid. But from our perspective, and to me, this is the beauty of it, that it is very straightforward, and it allows, we hope, the flexibility that people need to grow their business. I honestly have seen situations where companies have been restricted because it was going to cost so much to just redeploy to a new server that they had to look at alternatives of rewriting their applications when they were using a different COBOL compiler, because it would cost too much to just expand what they needed to expand to the number of servers where things needed to be deployed. Thankfully, they came to us and we were able to help them. And then they were able to grow their business at the rate and time that they really wanted to do it, where they couldn't with our competitors.
Great. And can you talk about how often NetCOBOL releases new versions?
Good question. And that's an interesting one. I have actually worked over the years, 40 plus years, with quite a few COBOL providers. One of the things that has historically proven to be true is that the Japanese development teams that work have a rigid adherence to quality. So NetCOBOL is probably not released as often, or updates are not released as often as they are with some of the other compilers out there. And in my opinion, that's kind of a good news, bad news thing. It is bad news in the sense that if you're looking for a new feature, it might take 6 months instead of 3 months. The good news is, based on my experience, that the quality of what you get is going to be outstanding. In general, we see a new major release for each of the compilers about every year. The difference for me and my experience is that, as opposed to places where I've worked before, where we would see a major release and then we would see 4 or 5 bug fix releases after that, there is almost never a bug fix release with Fujitsu NetCOBOL. It is just, as I've said a couple of times, rock solid.
And then another question came in, are there performance implications for the software that everyone should be aware of?
Oh, cool question. That's really cool. So yes, I think that there are. And I mentioned that we have some individual type of environments. We have NetCOBOL for .NET, NetCOBOL for Linux, and NetCOBOL for Windows. As opposed to most of the other players in the COBOL marketplace, where you kind of follow the Java model of you compile once and deploy anywhere, where I could compile on a Windows machine and deploy and run it in a Linux environment. NetCOBOL does not work that way. If I'm going to be deploying in a Linux environment, I need to compile in a Linux environment. And the reason for that is to ensure the best performance possible. If as a developer of a COBOL compiler, I have to account for every possible environment in which a compiled program might run, it's my opinion that I have to make some sacrifices. I have to, have extra code and extra overhead in place that really isn't necessary if I'm only working in my deployed environment. So it has been my experience and our thought that people will get the absolute best performance running with a COBOL compiler that is tuned for and geared for a particular deployment environment. And that's kind of the philosophy that Fujitsu has held, and that's the reason that we have so many large organizations that care so much about performance who choose NetCOBOL. Hope that made sense. Any other questions, Amanda?
I think we've covered all the questions that have just been submitted, but if anyone's got any late additions, I know you so graciously agreed to answer them for our blog. So we will, if there are any last questions, y'all can submit them online now, or you can email them our way. You can shoot it to me at amanda@cmg.org, and I will make sure that Walter gets those to answer them for you. And yes, we will have this video available for everyone to check out afterwards. And with that, Walter, thank you so much for your time today.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions. Thanks for taking the time to sit with us this afternoon. Look forward to talking with you again in the future, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.